Hi, welcome to One Eye on the Page. I'm Scott. This is 5-Year Battle Stephen King, down to the final 8. We had 10 books to go through each of the 5-year periods, starting from 1974 to present time, 2023. There is going to be another book published this year, but it's in September. If, for some reason, that book either knocks the 2019 to 2023 book or whatever ends up winning off, I will update this. I don't see it happening, but who knows? But I just wanted to go over the 10 books that we did have in those 10 5-year periods. Last time we had Dolores Claiborne in the Dark Tower VII, the Dark Tower, battle off to get into the final 8, and the Dark Tower VII won that. We also had Revival and Fairy Tale battle, and I think in a perhaps a bit of an upset for me, because I really thought, perhaps with some recency bias, that Fairy Tale was going to take the spot. And in the moment, and something that I still feel, I think Revival for me, I just published, I believe, 1994 through 1998 this week, and somebody commented about Insomnia. I figured me picking Insomnia as number one for that 5-year period was probably going to be the most controversial of any of the picks I had. So I just wanted to reiterate, these are my rankings. These aren't even my rankings for necessarily the best books, but my favorite. Sometimes they're the same thing, but sometimes they're not. Like, do I feel like subjectively or objectively Misery is written better than Insomnia? I do think it is written better than Insomnia, but I still like Insomnia better. Insomnia is still higher up in whatever my final ranking would be than Misery. So it's a personal opinion. I'm not going to agree with yours. You're not going to agree with mine. It's fine. So the other books we have, of course, are The Stand, which will be battling Dark Tower VII this episode. On Writing, the only nonfiction book to make it into the top 10, or the last 10 qualifiers, because it's the 5-year period. So does it mean it's within the top 10 of all Stephen King books for me? No, but it's number one in that 5-year period. And On Writing will be battling Different Seasons, and that will be next week. Then Insomnia, which will be battling Revival. And finally, 11/22/63, which will be battling It. But this week, we are talking about The Stand and the Dark Tower VII. Now, of course, when I'm talking about The Stand, I am talking about the original 1978 novel, not the 1990, complete and uncut. So it's not the complete and uncut edition. It's the 1978 edition. So, and then we will have that battling Dark Tower VII, published, I believe, in 2004. And it's the culmination of the Dark Tower series. Not the last Dark Tower book. And, of course, not the last mention of Roland and Gilead and this magnum opus that is the Dark Tower, that has kind of spread little cracks throughout the Stephen King universe. But it is the culmination of this Dark Tower series. I mentioned in the previous videos about each of these novels, but I want to go a little bit more in depth on them. The Stand was published in 1978, as I said. It was originally written as it was going to be a Patty Hearst novel, and I don't know. Uh, Many of you are probably too young for this, and I was too young for this. I don't really. It happened in my lifetime, I believe. It happened in my lifetime, I believe, but if it did, I was very young. Patty Hearst was a young rich woman who was kidnapped and basically held hostage for money, who ended up joining up with the people who kidnapped her. Obviously, that didn't work out, and we got The Stand instead. The Stand is a novel about the end of the world, basically. There is a virus, so it's really out there, something that would never happen. And it was government created, so complete fantasy. But it's called, well, it's Captain Trips is its nickname, and it kills 99.9, maybe 0.99% of the world's population. That takes up part of the novel, basically the disintegration of society as we know it. Then we have road trips because we have good guys and bad guys, or bad guys and clueless guys, or however you want to look at them. They're basically in this part of the world, because obviously there are survivors in the rest of the world. But in this part of the world, we have people who go to Boulder, Colorado, and people who go to, obviously, Las Vegas. You can figure out for yourself which ones are the bad guys. And so then there's the reforming of society. And I think here Stephen King does a really great job about showing the problems in society and how we often make the same mistakes. And the character of Glenn Bateman is a perfect, I guess, Greek chorus kind of explaining what's going on there. Now, this is where I get a little bit controversial, perhaps. I think up to the point, and if you have not read The Stand, and you don't want to know what happens in The Stand, you should probably stop watching this video, because I am going to talk a little bit about what happens in The Stand, and I will talk later about what happens in Dark Tower VII to kind of explain some of my reasoning why I rank these books. I will try not to go too in depth, but you are going to know something of what happens. Okay. I think the novel is amazing up until the point where Harold Lauder blows up the free zone, basically. Now, King has admitted that he didn't really know what to do. He saw the society forming, and they were doing basically the same things that society was doing before, and he didn't know how to get out of the mess. So basically, he took a sword to the Gordian knot, and he killed Nick Andrews, and he killed Sue Stern, or I believe, and some other people, but mainly Nick Andrews is who matters. And then this is the part I don't like. Well, there are several parts I don't like, mainly encompassing this final part of the novel. Mother Abigail, not my favorite character, basically says, forget all about this. You got to do what God says, and you have to go to Las Vegas and face off with the Man in Black, Randall Flagg. And they do. And I don't really care for this. I understand what Stephen King is doing with this. He's kind of talking about making the same mistakes. But even though it was more the trash can man than God, it's still kind of comes across as a bit of a Deus Ex Machina, and I didn't like it. I was generally okay with the sacrifices in Las Vegas, not only with everybody who was in Las Vegas, but the people who went there. But I just didn't like the whole hand of God stuff, and I didn't. I think one of the best things for the novel was when Mother Abigail left, and one of the worst things was when Mother Abigail came back. I often say, and I've said it in a video before, when I was talking about insomnia, I believe, that Bruce Springsteen's Jungleland is not my favorite song, but like the last 2 minutes and 37 seconds of Jungleland are my favorite piece of music. It's kind of the inverse with The Stand. If you take everything before Harold Lauder sets off the bomb, all that before, amazing novel, one of the best novels ever. After there is a lot of good stuff in there. Stu and Tom is good. Okay, there's not a lot of good stuff. There's some good stuff in there, but it's two parts. That first part, which is much longer, awesome. That second part, it's like it's a bad ending to an amazing movie. Can I still enjoy the movie? Yeah, but it's like I may stop watching before it gets to the end. Many of the characters are great. Harold Lauder is like the 1970s version of an incel. He's a wretched creature and pretentious, jealous, but he still merits our sympathy somewhat. Stu Redman is like, there's a reason he's named Redman, because he's like the every man. I mentioned it when I first talked about The Stand, when I first talked about many of King's first few books. King, at that point, did not write women extremely well. Franny is the number one female character, but still everything she is tied to a man, whether it be Jess originally, or Harold, or Stu. Once she meets up with Stu, she really becomes a secondary character, and there's no other female character that is as involved in a novel than her. There's Mother Abigail, but Mother Abigail is not a character. Mother Abigail is a plot tool. She's a stereotype. She's a trope. I just don't care for Mother Abigail. So that's a lot of the reasons why, even though I picked this as number one for 1974 to 1978, I still have a lot of problems with it. Now, have I read this book a lot? Hell yes, I have. I'm giving you some of the reasons why I might knock it down a bit, but it's still a great book. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about outside things here. The 1990s miniseries, pretty damn good, I think. Gary Sinise was a great Stu Redman. I didn't like the version of Harold Lauder in there, not because I had any issues with Korn Nemec, but I mean, Harold Lauder wasn't a pimply, scrawny kid. I believe Jamie Sheridan played Randall Flagg. I thought he did a good job. I thought Bill Fagerback, I believe. I may have gotten that name wrong, but he was on Coach, and he was also Marshall Erickson's dad on How I Met Your Mother. He played Tom Collin. He did a good job. Rob Lowe did a great job as Nick Andrews. I have not watched the most recent miniseries, and I don't really plan on it. I could. I don't know. My actual watching of Stephen King movies has the last one I watched was the first It, or part one of it in 2017, I believe. So I haven't really watched any Stephen King stuff recently, and I will still read his books, but for whatever reason, I don't really feel like watching the movies. Obviously, The Stand, not. I don't believe it's the best-selling Stephen King book. I believe that's probably either Carrie, Salem's Lot, or The Shining. I think The Shining, but I could be wrong there. But I do believe it is definitely in the running, if not as the most popular, it's one of the two most popular. I think if you did a combining of all the ranking of Stephen King books, that it and The Stand would be going back and forth on number ones. I doubt that there are too many rankings out there that doesn't have one of those two books as number one. I may be one of the few. I don't know yet. I seriously have not made the decision yet. Speaking of movies, Dark Tower has a movie. Haven't watched it. I am not going to watch it. It needs to be a series. We'll see if that ever happens. I've heard about The Talisman being made as a movie for coming up like almost 40 years now, and that hasn't happened. So, but that brings us to the Dark Tower VII. There are problems with this one too. One, as I mentioned in the video in which I talked about it originally, the villains, as it happens with a lot of Stephen King villains, especially in the last 20 or so years, aren't particularly scary or effective. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think a lot of Stephen King stuff now is more man versus himself instead of man versus man, or person versus person, however we want to phrase it. I just don't see a lot of Randall Flaggs and Annie Wilkes and Pennywise in his recent work. Generally, the villains are ineffective or misguided. I'm thinking of Revival when I say misguided. I mean, just looking at the stuff that he's published recently, the villains that I see that I would qualify as effective are just annoying as all hell, and often town selectsmen. Villains in Dark Tower 7 aren't particularly effective or memorable. And of course, there's the ending. Again, you should have known before when I said it, but this is spoilers. What happens in the Dark Tower 7 is that we go back to the beginning, because Roland gets to the tower and he finds himself at the beginning of what started in the Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, which is the man in black fled across the desert in the dark, and the Gunslinger followed. Except this time, he has his friend's horn, which shows that he's learning. It's obviously, or not obviously, but it seems like he's done this many times before. He keeps looping through this. And perhaps he has learned each time, or perhaps this is the first time he's learned, but he's learning. And so that means that hopefully, eventually, he will break the cycle. I don't think that he will ever get to the tower and find what he's looking for, but I don't think that's what he needs to do. As an ending, I think it's better than The Stand. I do not stand in the majority on this issue. Uh, I think people have come around a little bit on it, but definitely when it came out, people were angry about the ending. People were also angry about the sacrifices along the way. Eddie and Jake and Oi. And I was angry too, but they made sense. I'm very angry. I was pissed. Being pissed and understanding that it's essential for the book can coexist. Uh, as I believe I mentioned before, Eddie Dean is my favorite Stephen King character. Oi is one of my favorite animal characters. Some people may not like that. It makes sense for the story. It makes sense. It makes complete sense for Roland that his obsessive quest for the tower would, of course, it would entail sacrificing those he loves. And that's why he's learning, but he's learning damn slowly. So I think that the Dark Tower VII is a great ending to the Dark Tower series. But the issue is I'm not comparing the Dark Tower series to The Stand. I mean, if that was what I was doing, for me, the Dark Tower would be above Stand. Even with its messy and its strange parts, I still prefer the Dark Tower over the Stand. Also, the Stand is part of the Dark Tower if you look at it. But I'm comparing the one novel, The Dark Tower VII, The Dark Tower, versus The Stand. I haven't even mentioned it. I did mention it when I first talked about The Dark Tower VII. But Stephen King himself is also a character in here. That's another debate that people have. Author intrusion into the novel. I like it, but I understand it's not everybody's cup of tea. But also tea sucks, Ted Lasso. But I think when you just do a straight comparison, this book versus this book, I don't believe that the Dark Tower 7 by itself holds up to the Stand. Even despite the Stand's less than stellar ending, it's just overall as a novel, it works better. There are more memorable characters. The characters that are memorable from the Dark Tower 7 are characters that we generally have already met through the other Dark Tower books. It's more massive. I think it accomplishes more in its 800 or so pages than the Dark Tower 7 accomplishes, and I believe it's like 700 and something or whatever. So they're roughly the same number of pages, and I think The Stand accomplishes more in that. And another outside factor, The Stand takes its title from the Bruce Springsteen song. This is my first introduction to Bruce Springsteen. And then I read Christine, which really introduced me to Bruce Springsteen. So that's not a huge factor, but it is a factor. But I think if you even take Bruce Springsteen out of it, I still think The Stand goes over Dark Tower VII. The Dark Tower series goes over The Stand for me, but novel to novel, it's got to be The Stand. Which there's a very good chance that you're going to see The Stand in the final two. Not guaranteed, because next week is On Writing a Different Season, and both of those are amazing books. Do I think that either one of them will topple The Stand? Maybe not, but I also didn't think Revival will topple Fairy Tale. So I don't know which way my mind's going to go. The Stand has taken the win. I will see you next week when we do On Writing versus Different Seasons. It's been One Eye on the Page. If you like this content, please hit like or subscribe, and I will see you next time.